All right. So in Sunday morning, for the next several months, we'll be in the Gospel of Matthew, working our way through those 28 chapters together. And you know, when you think about Matthew, Mark, and Luke, there are a lot of similarities. Matthew, you got Mark, and you got Luke. And I mean, each of them is distinct, and each of them has some things that the other doesn't have. But basically, these three gospel accounts are called the synoptic gospels. And synoptic is a compound word that means, well, you know, optic. We talk about optics. Optics has to do with what?
What you see.
Yeah, the sight, the way you see things. And the prefix sin, S-Y-N, not S-I-N, but S-Y-N means what?
Working together.
With, literally with. So yeah, togetherness, working together. So the synoptics would have the idea that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are basically seeing the same thing. They're looking at the same thing. But then you have the Gospel of John. Now, John, the Gospel of John is different in a lot of ways. There is absolutely no contradiction, of course, between the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospels. But John deals with the life of Christ, if you will, in a different way than the Synoptic Gospels do. Sinclair Ferguson puts it this way. He says, the fourth Gospel has a different feel from the other three Gospels. And he quotes John Calvin to illustrate what he means. Calvin says this. He says, the other three are more copious in the narrative of the life and death of Christ, but John dwells more largely on the doctrine by which the office of Christ, together with the power of his death and resurrection, is unfolded. All of them, Calvin writes, all of them had the same object in view, to point out Christ. The three former, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, exhibit his body, Calvin says, if we may be permitted to use the expression, but John exhibits the soul. Goes on to explain, the Synoptic Gospels show us his body in the sense that they tell the story from the outside, as it were, but the nearer John's Gospel gets to the climax, to the end of the book, the more we learn about what's going on inside our Lord. And this is especially seen in chapters 13 to 17. Those 5 chapters have been called the Upper Room Discourse. And when you think about the amount of space dedicated to those few hours, it's really kind of remarkable. In comparison with Matthew, Mark, and Luke, John has a whole lot more material regarding that last night before the crucifixion than the other three gospel writers combined. He tells us things that Matthew, Mark, and Luke don't tell us. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell us a lot of things about actually, from the birth of Christ up to the upper room than John does. John doesn't talk about the birth of Christ at all. John doesn't talk about the temptation in the wilderness. He doesn't give us any details on that. I mean, there's a lot of things John doesn't tell us. But he does spend a lot of time talking about the events in that upper room. So I want us to, first of all, to take a look at the bigger context of the Gospel of John. So I think I have this on your handout. In chapter 1, verses 1 to 18 are the prologue. in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. And, John takes us back to eternity past, when Jesus, the Son, was with the Father. And he does that through verse 18. You get down to verse 14. The Word that was with the Father in eternity past became flesh. So those first 13, 14 verses, they're kind of like a prologue to Jesus coming into the world. Now, John doesn't talk about the birth of Christ. He just says the Word became flesh. He doesn't give us any details about that. All right, and then in chapter 1, verse 19, all the way to chapter 20, verse 31, you have these two books. John's Gospel can be generally divided into these two books. The first is the book of signs, from chapter 1:19 through the end of chapter 12. And the 7 signs. Did I give you the 7 signs? I didn't give you the 7 signs. Okay. So the 7 signs that John gives, they're the miracles that Jesus performed. But he gives us 7 of them in particular. The first one was the water turned to wine. The second one was the healing of the nobleman's son. The third one was the lame man at the pool of Bethesda. The fourth was the feeding of the 5,000. The fifth, when Jesus walked on water. The sixth, the blind man receives his sight. And the seventh was the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Okay, so those 7 signs again: water turned to wine, healing the nobleman's son, the lame man at the pool of Bethesda, feeding the 5,000, walking on water, the blind man receiving his sight, and Lazarus raised from the dead. So that's chapter 119 through the end of chapter 12. And then chapter 13 through the end of chapter 20 is called the Book of the Passion, or the Book of Glory. And then comes the epilogue, chapter 21. Okay? So in that larger framework, we have chapters 13 through 17. We have what's been called the Upper Room Discourse. Now here's what's fascinating about that. These 5 chapters occupy 18% of John's Gospel. All right? So think about this. I mean, almost 20% of John's Gospel is centered on these few hours. So the rest of his Gospel, probably 75% of the rest of his Gospel is zeroes in on or covers 30 years. Right? Well, actually, more like 3 years. Because once you get past the prologue, Jesus just comes on the scene in his public ministry. So 75% of his gospel is covering 3 years. Almost 20% of his gospel focuses on 3 or 4 hours of time. Okay? I think that's rather significant. And what he's doing here, what Jesus is doing in this upper room discourse, is he is patiently instructing his closest friends. Patiently instructing his closest friends just before the most painful, confusing events that they will ever have faced in their lives that are coming within the next 24 hours. All right, now with all that as a background, let's turn to chapter 13, John, and read these first 17 verses. And can we read it around so I'm not just doing all the talking here? Let's start over here with Jim. Start with verse 1, and we'll work across the first row, go back to the second row, and then come over here to the back row, and we'll end with Dan. Okay? So, Jim.
Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of the world into the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end.
And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him.
Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come from God and was going to God,
rose from supper. He laid aside his outer garments, and taking a towel, tied it around his waist.
Verse 5, Shirley?
After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel wherewith he was girded.
Then cometh he to Simon Peter, and Peter saith unto him, Lord, dost thou wash my feet?
Jesus answered and said unto Jesus answered and said unto him, What I do now thou knowest not now, but thou shalt know hereafter.
Peter said to him, You shall never wash my feet. Jesus answered him, If I do not wash you, you have no part with me.
Simon Peter said to him, Lord, not my feet only, also my hands and my head.
Jesus saith to him, He that is washed needeth not save to wash his feet, but is clean every whit, and ye are clean, but not all.
For he knew who should betray him, therefore he said, Ye are not all clean.
So when he had washed their feet, taken his garments, and sat down again, he said to them, Do you know what I have done to you?
You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, Well, for so I am.
If I then, your Lord and Master, have washed your feet, ye also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I have done to you. Verily, verily, I say unto you, the servant is not greater than his Lord, neither is he that is sent greater than he that sent him. If you know these things, happy are ye if you do them.
Okay, what I want you to do now is kind of skim through, especially the early verses, maybe down to verse 12. Skim through verses 1 to 12, and what are the 7 things that Jesus knew? Now, they're not scattered throughout the whole 12. They're kind of concentrated first in a couple of verses. But there are 7 different things that Jesus knew in these verses. So skim through that for a second, and then let's see if we can identify what those things are that Jesus knew. Let's see what we can find. What's the first thing that Jesus knew?
His hour had come.
Okay, I just put down here timing. Jesus knew that his hour had come. All right? Secondly,
the Father had given all things into his hands.
Okay, the Father had given all things into his hands, so that comes down to verse 3. That would be number 4 on my list. And I used a one-word description to describe that. He knew the gifts that had been given. So back up in verse 1, he knew the timing that his hour had come. What else? He elaborates on that.
That he should depart out of this world.
Okay, that he should depart out of this world. So the second thing he knew was his departure. His departure.
He knew who was going to betray him.
Okay, and that comes down in verse 11. So number 7 on your list there is I use the word plot. Plot. He knew who would betray him. Okay? So we still got number 3. He knew his timing. He knew his departure. His hour had come. He would depart from this world.
He'd come from God.
And he was, okay, let's hold on to that one for a minute. Here in verse 1, he knew his hour had come. He knew that he should depart from the world. To where?
Not to the Father.
To the Father. Okay, so he knew that his hour had come, that he was going to depart from this world. Thirdly, that he was going to go to the Father. So I use the word welcome, just to kind of keep this in my mind. Welcome. He was going to the Father. He'd be welcomed back in glory, if you will, by the Father. We already talked about gifts. Number 4 comes down in verse 3. Jesus, knowing that his Father had given all things into his hands. All right, and then Jeannie just mentioned that he had come from God. I use the word origin. Origin. O-R-I-G-I-N. Origin. He knew where he came from. He had come from God. And what's the next thing in verse 3? He knew he was going to the Father. So destination is the word I use to summarize that thing he knew. He knew his destination. And then the 7th thing is in verse 11, where it says he knew who would betray him. All right? So Jesus knew the timing. His hour had come. And that timing involves his death. He knew his death was coming. Look back at chapter 12 and verse 23. Jesus answered them, saying, "The hour has come that the Son of Man should be glorified." How is that going to happen? Verse 27, Jesus says, "Now my soul is troubled. What shall I say? Father, save me from this hour?" What is involved in this hour? It's what's coming in 24 hours. Save me from this hour, but for this purpose I came to this hour. And verses 32 and 33, Jesus says, if I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all peoples to myself. This he said, signifying by what death he would die. So, in knowing his timing, Jesus knew that he was going to be dying and how that death was going to take place. He knew his timing. He knew that he was departing from this world. He knew that he would be welcomed by the Father. He knew that the Father had given him all things, these gifts. He knew that he had come from God. He knew he was going to God. And in verse 11, he knew who would betray him. Now, verse 2 gives us some insight into what Jesus knew about that traitor, the one who's going to betray him. That is, that Satan had put into the heart of Judas Iscariot to betray Jesus. Jesus knew this. He knew this. Okay, now, second question I want us to consider is, what did Jesus do because of what he knew? What did he do because of what he knew? Last part of verse 11. Last part of verse 1.
He loved.
He loved.
Endless love.
He loved his own. These whom he knew the Father had given to him. He loved his own. So this knowledge that Jesus had, all these things, you take them all together, put them all together. All this that Jesus knew, it evoked within him a love for his own that he would continue to demonstrate right to the very end. Now we can say two things about this knowledge that evoked love. His knowledge evoked a targeted love. A targeted love. What do I mean by that? Well, it says, having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. Okay? Now, that word, love, you know it well. You see it all over the place in the Gospels, in the New Testament. It's the Greek word. We transliterate it this way. No, that's not the way they do it. They do it with an E on the end. I was thinking of the Greek spelling. Agape. It's not agape, but agape. And what is the essential quality of agape type love?
Unconditional.
It is unconditional,
Sincere.
sincere. Is it or is it not? Is it tied to feelings or is it not tied to feelings?
Nah.
It's not. It is not. It is not. Now, there may be feelings that are associated with agape love, but agape love is not essentially how you feel about someone. Okay. What else can you say about agape love?
Sacrificial.
Sacrificial. Yes. So agape love is a kind of self-sacrificial love. It is conscious. In other words, the person who is expressing agape love consciously gives of themselves, so it's conscious, and it is others-oriented. It is directed to somebody else. It is a conscious, self-sacrificial action for the benefit of the one or ones loved. Okay? So this love that Jesus has here at the end of verse 1, that is evoked by what he knows, is a targeted love to his own. Well, who are they? Who are his own? Let's look back a few chapters to chapter 10. Chapter 10. And look at verse 14. How does Jesus describe his own?
His sheep.
His sheep. Right. His sheep. And the relationship that he has to his sheep is, he refers to in verse 13, in contrast to the hireling who doesn't care about his sheep. In fact, he says, I know my sheep, and what does he do for those he knows? Verse 15.
Lay down my life for the sheep.
Lays down his life for the sheep. All right, so now here we are in chapter 13 in the upper room, less than 24 hours before he's going to be lifted up, laying down his life for his sheep, and he's loving them to the very end. They are his sheep. And how are they his sheep? Look at verse 27 of chapter 10. And then dovetail it with verse 29. It says, my sheep hear my voice, and I know my sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. How is it that they are his sheep? Verse 29. My Father, who has given them to me, is greater than all. All right? So, back in chapter 13, when John tells us that Jesus loved his own who were in the world, he's talking about these sheep that the Father has given to him. All right? So his knowledge evokes a targeted love. The second thing we can say about this love is that it is a perfect love. His knowledge evoked a perfect love. This is expressed in the last three words of verse 1. He loved them to the end. To the end. That word could be translated in a couple of different ways. It doesn't mean like to the end of his life. It doesn't mean that kind of end. It means to the uttermost. I think one of the translations actually had used that word. Love them to the uttermost. Another way it could be translated is love them to perfection, or love them with total fullness. So here's the point I want us to get. As fallen, sinful, typically self-thoughtful people, if we were in this kind of a position where we knew that, I'm going to die within 24 hours. I'm going to be executed within 24 hours. What would that knowledge evoke within us? How would our thoughts be directed?
Well, I thought of that verse, he demonstrated his love for us, and that while we were yet sinners, he died for us. So he demonstrated his love for us.
In his death, he demonstrated his love for us. He's going to demonstrate his love for his own tonight, in this Last Supper, in this upper room. But typically when we, as human beings, the typical response as natural, sinful, fallen human beings, when we're confronted with such knowledge that tomorrow I'm facing my execution, upon whom are our thoughts normally or typically directed? Jean, what are you going to say?
I was just going to say it strips away all the things that are not essential or not important. And so the things that are usually important are like your family and friends and people you love and care about.
Yeah, certainly we would think about our family and the heartache and grief that's going to be cause them. And what does that evoke within us?
Usually self-centered.
Yeah, there's a self-centeredness about it that is marked by things like grief, sorrow, solemn sadness over the fact that they are going to be going through such difficulty, our loved ones, and maybe a great deal of fear for ourselves because of the pain and anguish and everything else we're going to be experiencing, when it comes in the next few hours. In other words, yeah, in our fallenness, if we knew the kinds of things Jesus knew was coming in his pain and anguish and betrayal and all the rest of that, we would tend to be very self-absorbed and self-focused. But not Jesus. Jesus, this knowledge evoked within him a targeted, perfect, agape, self-sacrificial, conscious love for his own. Loving them to perfection. Now, how did Jesus express this love? Verses 2 through 11, very simply we can summarize it with these three words. In verses 4 and 5, he served them, rose from supper, washed their feet. In verses 6 through 10, he expressed this perfect love as he corrected them, and particularly Peter. Peter said, "Oh, you're not going to wash my feet, Lord. You're too good for that." And Jesus corrected Peter. And the third way is how he confronted him in verses 10 and 11. He confronted the betrayer. He who is bathed needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. But you are clean, but not all of you are clean, for he knew who would betray him. So he expressed his perfect love as he confronted even the betrayer. Even the betrayer. Now, why did Jesus express his love in these ways? Why did he express his love in these ways? Was he washing their feet just because he wanted to do something to serve them and make their feet feel better and get the dust off their feet? What's behind that? Why did he do this? Two basic reasons. All right, first of all, he wanted to provide a powerful object lesson. Powerful object lesson. In verse 13, we just kind of have a hint at this very point. He says, "You call me teacher and Lord." And as a teacher, he's going to provide an object lesson. "And you say, well, for so I am." I am your teacher. So in his teaching, he wants to provide a powerful object lesson. He wants to show his love to his own by providing this powerful object lesson. All right, now, on your handout, I gave you this comparison between John 13, our passage this morning, and Philippians 2, verses 6 through 9. So let's turn to Philippians 2. We've already read the passage in John. So let's look at Philippians 2. And verses 6 through 9, and kind of walk through this grid, this comparison grid. Verse 5 of Philippians 2, Paul exhorts us to have the mind of Christ, the attitude of Christ, the perspective of Christ. Let this mind be in you, which was in Christ Jesus. All right, what was the mind of Christ? What was the mind of Christ in this upper room in John 13? What was his mind? All right? His mind. He was in the form of God. So, though being in the form of God, this parallels what we read in John 13, that Jesus knew that he had come from God. Okay? And that can take us back to John 1, and we may have time to do that in just a minute. Secondly, though being in the form of God, he did not consider it robbery to be equal with God. That could be translated or expressed this way. He did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped. Like, I've got to hang on to this glorious equality with God. That compares with John 13. He rose from supper to do what he's about to do. And what did Jesus do in Philippians 2:7? He made himself of no reputation, the New King James says. The King James Version says he emptied himself. This is pictured in the object lesson in John 13 with the laying aside of his garments. Then, in Philippians 2, he took the form of a servant. John 13, he picked up the towel. This is the action of a servant. The lowest of servants had this job that Jesus is about to do. He humbled himself, poured water in the basin. He became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross, verse 8. He washed the disciples' feet. Again, the lowest servant did this most menial of tasks for the guests in a home. And then verse 9, therefore, God also has highly exalted him, given him the name which is above every name. Parallels in the object lesson, the picture that Jesus got up, put his garments back on, sat down. He resumed his place there in the upper room. All right? So here's this parallel. Philippians, Paul lays out in a very clear description of the theological import of what Jesus did in becoming man, dying on the cross, and then being exalted by the Father. So Paul lays that out very clearly. Jesus, in John 13, is portraying that with a living lesson, with an object lesson. And it's an object lesson that communicates these few things. It communicates, first of all, his origin. His origin. So back in John 13, verse 3, Jesus knows that he had come from God. He had come from God. And this parallels very, very nicely with John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the fact that in his incarnation, John 1:14 tells us that Christ came down to be with us. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Okay? So his origin. Secondly, this is an object lesson of his humiliation. His humiliation. Verses 4 and 5. Jesus rose from supper, laid aside his garments, took a towel, girded himself, poured water in a basin, and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. As I indicated, in this parallels the Philippians passage where Jesus emptied himself. He emptied himself. Now, I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk about that theological point and how it's been variously interpreted. Just to throw out the question, what does it mean that he emptied himself? Does it mean, like in Wesley's hymn, that he emptied himself of all but love? And what Wesley was trying to communicate there, seems to have said, is that it could be interpreted that Wesley was saying that Jesus relinquished all of his divine attributes, his incommunicable attributes, like omniscience and omnipotence and omnipresent and all that. So he emptied himself of all of those things except for divine love. That can't be true, because we have too many examples in the gospel accounts of Jesus expressing omnipotence and omniscience. So we can't conclude that. Some more up-to-date hymn writer or hymnologists have taken that hymn and modified it a little bit and said he emptied himself and came in love, thereby not describing the emptying. Sinclair Ferguson puts it this way, and I'll just read this and we'll move on because we want to get to the last two ideas here. God's Son emptied himself not by subtraction from his deity, but by addition. That is, by his assumption of frail humanity. The one who never ceased to be in the form of God took the form of a servant with the accompanying life of deep humiliation. He gave all that he ever was to us and for us when he took on our human nature. And he did so to take away our sin. And then this point. He emptied himself not by evacuating himself of the eternal attributes that he possessed, but by taking temporal attributes that he did not possess. Okay? God is not confined to time and space, so to speak. All right, anyway, however the theologians want to argue about that and just to come to a conclusion about it, the bottom line is very clearly that this emptying of himself on the part of Jesus was a profoundly humble work on his part. So this washing of the feet is a beautiful picture of his humiliation. Third point in the object lesson is his work of salvation. His work of salvation. And this is the point of verses 6 through 10. When Jesus gets to Peter, Peter says, "Well, you're not going to wash my feet." And Jesus says to him, if I don't wash your feet, then you're telling me you don't have any part with me. And then Peter replies and says, well, give me a bath. Wash all of me. And Jesus replies and says, he who is bathed, in verse 10, needs only to wash his feet, but is completely clean. You are clean, speaking plurally of the disciples, but not all of you whose feet are being washed. Not all of you are clean. He's referring there to Judas, of course. So when Jesus says, he who is bathed, and then he says, you are clean, this is a picture that Jesus is communicating of justification. Justification. When you are saved and justified in God's sight, you are in God's sight clean from your sin. However, you and I both know that every day as we walk through this filthy world, we get our feet dirty with sin of some kind or another. And so, we need this regular washing of our feet. This is the process of sanctification. All right? So, Jesus is communicating here through this object lesson a picture of salvation, both in justification and sanctification. And then, lastly, his object lesson includes the picture of his exaltation. In verse 12, he washed their feet, took his garments, sat down again. He put on what had been laid aside. He put on what had been laid aside. Now, here we can go back to John 10 and verses 17 and 18, where Jesus says, my Father loves me because I lay down my life, but I take it up again. I lay down my life that I may take it up again. And so when he lays aside his garments and then takes his garments and puts them back on, it's the same terminology that is being communicated here. So is humiliation. So one of the purposes, why did Jesus love them in this way? To teach an important object lesson. Secondly, to establish an essential pattern. Establish an essential pattern. In verses 14 to 17. Jesus says, if I, your Lord and teacher, washed your feet, you